sound mind in a sound body is one of ASICS. It's big. It's probably the biggest. It comes from the acronym, doesn't it? I mean, what does that mean to you, and how significant is that in a world where mental health seemingly, we have come a long way, but there is still a fair way to go in terms of getting the message out there of how important it is?
On a personal level, it's created accountability for me because I work in the sport and exercise field. So for me, I put physical activity as a priority. I have a routine, but equally that means I need to rest properly as well, because I'm always talking about the benefits of physical activity. But as somebody who also works in eating disorders, I know the risk of over-exercising. So on a personal basis, it's really important. On a kind of systemic and kind of like societal level, it's great to partner with this intervention because we've always advocated for parity of esteem between physical health and mental health. And as a clinician, it's been a privilege to see that message grow in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. The example I can give is working in cricket. The funding and support we now have for mental health is very similar to physical health. And I think that's a good indicator that that message is getting out there.
And in athletics specifically as well, what are the biggest, learnings? I mean, you showed me a book that you've done as well. What are the biggest learnings that you've seen within the kind of the mental health and the physical kind of relationship with that as well, within running and athletics more generally?
One thing I would say is in elite sport, the support systems tend to be better. So there is a level of accountability. So if an athlete is over-exercising or is in relative malnutrition, we can put a support team around them and say, look, we need to reduce activity, we need to look at your meal plan, we need to do blood tests, etc. But I think the real risk lies in people who are not professional athletes, but high-level exercisers, because there isn't as much accountability in terms of the levels of activity that they're doing. And that's often what I see in clinic. So I may see people in clinic who are high functioning and using exercise as an outlet to manage their mental health, which there's nothing wrong with that in principle, but you've got to have other ways to manage your mental health. It can't be purely down to physical activity. So that's something that I often tend to see, and that's one thing that I always discuss when I meet people in outpatient clinic or meet them within the team environment. The other thing that I always think about is, well, what is the function? What is the function of doing sport? Within the elite sport setting, it makes more sense because that is their job, that's their occupation. And with that, there can be an element of being very rigid with calories or rigid with their physical activity. But that tends to be in season or in competition, and they should be able to switch off in the off season. So I think it's always important to look at function. The other thing to think about with athletes is the performance versus purpose narrative. So often I meet athletes who have a clear purpose in terms of why they're doing their sport, and that could be helpful, and they tend to fare better from a well-being perspective. Whereas those who are purely focused on metrics, so thinking about PBs or gold medals or podiums, etc., that can be a disadvantage. So it's always important to look at an athlete's identity and think about their life outside of sport as well.
I was about to say, I mean, talking about the biggest learnings, you cover so many facets within the mental kind of health, physical health space. Again, talking about some of the learnings, you alluded to eating disorders there being one of them. Are you able to open up about kind of others as well, and how, because with each athlete that comes in, you learn pretty yourself about some of the challenges that are faced in the world at the minute about this topic?
It's best, in my opinion, it's best to view things as a spectrum, because conventionally in psychiatry it's viewed as, is this an illness, yes or no, what's the diagnosis, do we have a name for that? In my experience, particularly when we're talking about physical activity and eating disorders, it can be a grey area, and it's best to view it as a spectrum. So the examples I can give is we can have normal eating, in inverted commas, and we may view that as eating that's responsive to hunger, to appetite, to emotions, and then we can go along a spectrum. So we can have disordered eating, like I mentioned before, where we can get a bit too rigid on physical activity or our eating patterns, but that can be functional for an athlete for a very time-limited period, and then they can switch off if it's off-season. Where this becomes a problem is if there's an ongoing issue and we're talking about ongoing malnutrition, ongoing overexercise or food restriction or disordered eating behaviours. And that's where we may then insidiously end up with an eating disorder like anorexia nervosa, or it's often called relative energy deficiency in sport. And that's where we then, not only are we picking up localised injuries, but we're at risk of systemic injuries. So we're talking about things like osteopenia of the bones, so thinning of the bones, or osteoporosis, we're at high risk of fractures, but also our internal hormonal system. So if we're talking about sex hormones, sex drive, these things can be impacted as well. So I think the benefit that I have as a sports psychiatrist is I can see things from a wellbeing perspective. I can see when something is becoming slightly disordered and we can get in sooner and say, look, let's think of a treatment plan to stop this becoming a severe problem. So that's the example I can give from an eating perspective. And it's very similar thing about the exercise spectrum as well. We can go from recreational physical activity, which we know has an antidepressant effect. It can be very good for depression. But if we engage in ongoing exercise, which is obsessive or compulsive, and we're not resting sufficiently, we're not going to get the benefits of adaptation. We're not going to get recovery. We're then going to be at risk of injuries again, and some of the kind of internal injuries that I mentioned before. So yeah, it can be insidious, but it's important to view it as a spectrum. I always think that's quite helpful to frame it within sport.
And in terms of any examples that you've seen, I mean, you've probably had hundreds and thousands potentially over the years. Are there any ones which stand out generally about people who have come in here and then they've come out and you've gone, whoa, okay, that's a marked change?
We always use the biopsychosocial approach, and I found it helpful to support athletes in that perspective. And often that may mean not using medication. And what I've found helpful, or the most powerful, is when we have consensus, not just from the athlete, but from the team as well. So that might be the coach, it might be the support team, but also their family or kind of loved ones. So if we have clear communication from the start, we know that creates that accountability. And then we're also mindful of what their short-term and long-term motivators are. So we're very open in terms of what we're trying to achieve together. The things that stand out is when we've got a consensus. So if we go to the biopsychosocial approach, when we've got consensus from a physical health perspective, I was talking about eating disorders before, or exercise addiction, if we can be transparent with what the dietetic meal plan is going to look like, what we're looking for on the blood tests, what we're looking at the kind of metrics from a physical health perspective. If we're going to go down the medication route, whether that's for physical health or for mental health, what we're looking for objectively. So we can use screening tools, which look at low mood, anxiety, eating disorders, etc. So that for me is helpful. And then the psychological approach has been very clear about what support we're using, whether that's cognitive behaviour therapy, dialectical behaviour therapy, interpersonal therapy. We have lots of integrated approaches we can use. And the social support is about the entourage. How do we involve loved ones or coaches or family, etc.? And that for me feels very valued work, because we've created that team approach and we're working together. And in the line of work that I do, I tend to see that within disordered eating, eating disorders, relative energy deficiency in sport. The overlap with that is we often know that people who are in relative malnutrition tend to experience low mood as well, or they can have anxiety, and they can also have burnout because they are so depleted of energy that it impacts on their mood and physical health. So it's very satisfying when we've got somebody out of that space and when you see them training again and they're back on the screen competing.
You mentioned you've done a lot of work with ASICS elite athletes, but you've also done work with ASICS front runner as well. I mean, how different? Is the approach different, or do you feel that there are transferable kind of areas, for example, from one to the other? And how do you view kind of working with an elite athlete versus someone who's in mass participation running, for example?
The principles remain the same. From my perspective, there shouldn't be any change in the treatment principles and the modalities we offer. What I would say is it's important to understand the context of their sport. Just like anybody doing a job, like ourselves, we do day-to-day jobs. It's understanding the context of that. and how that can impact on their daily function. So the principles between the sports don't necessarily change, but understanding the context and how that impacts on their day-to-day routine, their relationships, their function, I think that's the most important thing.
Just a few more from me. I mean, is there any research which you've done which stands out, for example, when you look at this topic that you'd be able to talk about?
So a few years ago, we collaborated with several international researchers looking at exercise addiction. And what we found was those who had an eating disorder, which were at much higher risk of exercise addiction compared to those who don't have eating disorders. So we know very clearly that there is a link between disordered eating and exercise addiction. Like I mentioned before, we did a book a few years ago called Case Studies in Sports Psychiatry, and we did this book for the exact reason we've described today, because we felt that there was a gap in terms of understanding of the elite athlete needs within different sports and how mental health can present. So we did that with elite athletes themselves, but also with the researchers, those working in sport. And that was quite helpful because getting the expert by experience approach, it's often not as well documented in the medical literature, but it's really important that we learn from that. So that was quite a satisfying project to be part of.
And have you done any research within ASICS specifically as well? Because I know they've had studies, movement of mind, for example, is one of them.
So I've not been involved with the exercise studies, so that was done by Prof. Brendan Stubbs.
Yeah.
But it is something that I reference, especially in the general adult population on my outpatient clinic, if we're thinking about lifestyle interventions for mental health or mental illness. One thing that I have been quite actively involved with is called the Royal College of Psychiatry Sport and Exercise Group, which I previously chaired. So they've got lots of free resources on their website. There's also a free open access journal called the Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychiatry, which I'm an editor for. But that's free to download, free to access, and that's the first ever journal looking at severe mental illness and how to manage that within sport. And for those who are kind of in the US or looking at international papers, there is the International Society of Sports Psychiatry, and they have resources as well.